Welcome back. This is Module 3, Lecture 1. We'll be talking about the phenomenon known as socialization, which I've obviously written up here. Socialization in the field of sociology is the basis for the debate that goes on between, and you've probably heard these terms before, nature versus nurture, and what is the better description or analysis of human behavior. When we talk about nature, we talk about the idea that the ways we behave are handed down to us. In other words, through heredity. So the ways that people act before us were handed down to us biologically or genetically, and that forms the basis for our behavior. The counter to that, of course, is the discussion of nurture, that the reasons we behave the way we are primarily due to our social environment. In other words, how we're raised and the environment that affects us. So to answer this question, which is more important, nature versus nurture, as sociologists, one of the things obviously we want to do is take a look at the research that has been done on human development. And sometimes when we want to examine something, one of the best ways to examine it is to discuss what happens in the absence of a thing. So we're going to talk about what happens when human beings do not, quote unquote, kind of go through what we consider to be the typical stages of human development, or in which that development is somehow deprived or interrupted from those children. Once again, when we're talking about social research, there are things that we as sociologists cannot do. So in other words, it would be unethical, illegal, and of course just plain wrong to, let's say, take a child and raise it in an environment without any social skills or socialization that we obviously would consider to be damaging to a child. So that would be unethical and just, like I said, plain wrong. However, there are times in history in which these things take place, and social scientists, psychologists, other researchers are able to study those phenomena. So we'll be taking a look at a couple of those right here. The first thing you see I've listed up here is the idea we can study feral children. Feral means wild, so we're talking about children raised in an environment with almost absolutely no social environment whatsoever. One of the most famous of these occurred in France in 1798. A teenage boy was discovered in the woods outside of a village called Aveyron in France, and quickly became known as the Wild Boy of Aveyron. So this was anybody looking at this child could clearly recognize that he was post-puberty, so he had all the secondary sex characteristics of a adolescent who had gone through puberty and basically had been living in the woods outside of this town in France for some time. People point to the idea that, and again, sometimes the source of many of our fairy tales comes from real life situations. If you're familiar with the idea of Hansel and Gretel, and I usually ask classes, tell me about Hansel and Gretel, and one of the common things is, oh, they got lost in the woods. That's the Disney version. Grimm's fairy tales and many of the old fairy tales are much more harsh. In times of starvation, parents who wanted to avoid the guilt of either watching their children die or being responsible for their children's deaths would sometimes take them to the woods and deliberately abandon them. The reasoning being that they weren't killing their children, that nature would take care of it, or in other words, kind of leaving it up to fate or a higher power. So, again, a bit of an aside, the Wild Boy of Aveyron was probably a child who had been abandoned by his or her parents, his parents at an earlier time. And when he was discovered, possessed absolutely no language whatsoever, absolutely did not know anything about social behavior. Many attempts, many researchers at the time, including a few social scientists. This is obviously pre-sociology, but those people who studied human behavior would definitely came around to try to study the wild boy, and many attempts were made at trying to tame him, as far as teaching him to wear clothing and sit at a table and use utensils when eating. And largely, most of those attempts were utter failures. One researcher in particular spent very much many years with a boy who was eventually named Victor, and found that it was almost impossible to get Victor to, again, use speech, acquire language, wear clothing, use utensils, develop skills, those kind of things. So what can we say about an extreme example like this? Clearly, it points to the idea that this child was missing something. There was something absent from his development which made him unable, even at a later time in life, to regain a lot of what we would call social skills. We can also take a look at isolated children. Once again, unfortunately, sometimes in society, children are subject to abuse or neglect. Again, not that sociologists are happy about these situations, but when they do occur, it is sometimes very useful to gain information from these. Again, a very prominent case early in the about the 1930s, I believe it was the case of a young girl about 6.5 years old named Isabel, who was discovered living in an attic with her deaf-mute mother. She was put there by her grandfather. Her mother was unmarried and, as I said, had a lot of her own developmental issues. When she became pregnant, the grandfather, basically through shame, locked both the mother and this young baby into the attic. So Isabel suffered a lot of debilitating physical disabilities, as well as deprivation of things like sunlight, vitamins, and nutritional regimen. But probably the most important thing is that she was largely deprived of human interaction. And when she was discovered at about the age of 6.5, she lacked basically the ability to communicate with language. She could only communicate through a series of grunts and moans, basically indicating that she wanted food. That was about it. The interesting thing about Isabel's situation is that, obviously being rescued at an early age, every attempt was made then at providing her with everything that she had been deprived of, including social skills. And Isabel, while she definitely exhibited a lot of problems later on in life, was able to gain some level of language, some cognitive and motor skills that she lacked earlier. So in a sense, she was able to benefit from exposure to a social environment and regain some of the things that she had lost in her early development. One of the things we can definitely tell from both of these cases, is that human beings have no natural language ability. As we talked about in Module 2, when we talked about culture, culture is learned, and a very important part of culture is language. So we definitely know that this lack of shared ideas is a key or the sharing of ideas based on language is a key to our social development. So we can definitely tell that in both these cases, these children, both the wild boy of Averone and Isabel, basically were given genetic heritage. They were given their parents' DNA and physical characteristics, but what they lacked was a social environment which superimposes on that heredity. Another example of research into this field would be a study of institutionalized children. So children which are not necessarily deprived of social environment, but which lack what we would call appropriate social environment. Two very important researchers by the name of Skeels and Dye did a lot of research into this, starting with orphanages in the 1930s. Obviously, with the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, many families in crisis, many children ended up in orphanages. And Skeels and Dye followed many children who were raised in orphanages. They also assisted in some ways in having those children placed outside of orphanages into homes. So they were conducting an experiment, which had an experimental group, individuals who were adopted outside of the orphanages, and a control group, those children which stayed in the orphanages. So they're able to look at a number of variables. One of the most important, and one of the most important independent variables, in other words, the thing that they would introduce to the experiment to create change, was the difference between the amount of individual attention. As you can imagine, in the 1930s, orphanages were pretty much warehouses for children. The children were, for the most part, cared for, but didn't receive a lot of individual instruction, individual attention, whereas children who were adopted into families were much more likely to receive a higher level of one-on-one attention. So basically what they were looking at was the amount of human interaction, human contact that children were exposed to would be the independent variable. And then they used many things as measures, in other words, the dependent variables, one of which was IQ, another one was level of education, another one was what we would call social placement. In other words, were the children likely to gain jobs, avoid things like jail or breaking the law, or drug and alcohol addiction, those kind of things. So Skeels and Dye followed a number of children for a very, very, very long time. When they published in 1966, they had studied some of these children most of their lives. And what they generally found is in the control group, again, the children who were raised in orphanages, who had very little or deprived of a lot of one-on-one attention and human contact, generally the results were lower IQs, that these children generally did not pursue education to a large degree after getting out of the orphanages, and that they generally had what would be considered poor social placement. In other words, they generally tended to do more menial labor, what we would call less prestigious jobs, often engaged in criminal activity, as well as high rates of drug and alcohol abuse. Whereas in the experimental group, those children that were raised in environments in which there was higher social contact, we generally saw higher IQs. Again, didn't mean that all those students were guaranteed to be geniuses, and we saw higher educational levels, or at least the level of the average at the time, but certainly higher than those in the control group, as well as just generally much more stable social placement, much more likely to get better jobs, to avoid things like drug and alcohol abuse, and to avoid law breaking or jail time. So again, what Skeels and Dye concluded is not just, again, not in the absence of a social environment such as feral children and isolated children, but even just the quality of the human contact we have has a large to do with how we develop as social creatures. And then the very last one I have up here is related to deprived animals. Again, it seems sometimes confusing that we would relate animal behavior to human behavior when we're talking about our development. But clearly we know that there are many creatures that exhibit a lot of the same social characteristics that human beings do, and there can be a lot of information gained from the study of that social behavior. One researcher, a couple by the name of the Harlows, who again in the 1960s studied effects of various social experiments on monkeys. Again, very closely related to us, not only in DNA, as far as our nature and heredity, but exhibit a lot of the same social characteristics as human beings, so there is something to be gained from studying these animals. Basically, one of the most important things that the Harlows concluded, and there's a picture of this, very famous picture, which you will be able to see in your text when you're reading this and reviewing this section, is a picture of two different types of mothers that these young monkeys, infant monkeys, would be exposed to. One mother, and again, just basically kind of a fake monkey, wrapped in chicken wire, but had the ability to feed the animal. So it had a bottle coming out of this fake head, infant monkeys could feed from. And the other mother was, again, same structure, didn't have the bottle, so no ability to feed the infant monkey, but was wrapped in terry cloth, very soft, warm material. And typically when we think of animals, we think what's the thing that drives animals, and we usually think of the instinct to feed. So the hypothesis would be that infant monkeys would be much more attracted to the mother that could feed it as opposed to the one that couldn't. And the Harlows expose these infant monkeys to all sorts of different stimuli, sometimes scaring them, bringing on different types of reactions from the monkeys. And almost always, the infant monkeys preferred the mother that had the terry cloth wrapped around it. In other words, something that the infant monkey could cling to, that tactile sensation of being able to touch and grab and hug. The terry cloth mother was more important to the young monkeys than the ability to be fed. So we definitely look at this idea of intimate physical contact is more important in a lot of cases to social creatures than is the ability to feed. The Harlows also did things like isolating the monkeys from each other for longer and longer periods of time to study the effects of that isolation and whether or not when they were reintegrated into the society they'd be able to fully integrate again and learn and pick up the social behaviors. One of the things that they found and also supported some of the findings of institutionalized children is that there definitely seems to be a period of time and again, human beings, it roughly coincides with adolescence or puberty, this kind of idea of a point of no return, where if children are not exposed to social environment and language especially, by the time they're about 12, 13 years old, that they may not be able to learn that behavior later on in life. The Harlows definitely demonstrated that with, again, these young monkeys, that if some young monkeys were isolated for too long a period of time beyond a certain period of development, that they may never acquire those skills ever again and basically become, as we looked at in human beings, feral children. This also explains the big difference between, let's say, the wild boy of Averone, who was a teenager, as opposed to Isabel, at about 6.5 years old, was able to gain those skills back. So we talk about this idea of a point that roughly coincides with the onset of puberty in human beings that says that these skills have to be learned by this time. If they are not, it may be quote-unquote too late. So we talk about this idea of a critical stage not being able to be relearned at a later time. So when we wrap up all these things, as sociologists, clearly, when we study the phenomena such as feral children, isolated children, institutionalized children, and deprived animals, it clearly weighs much more toward this idea of nurture. That as sociologists, clearly we take the stance that nurture is much more important to nature. Certainly we are products of our heredity. Our genetic makeup is given to us by those people who spawned us, but that our nurture, our social environment, is basically a template laid on top of that biological determination that actually creates us as human beings, which basically then leads to this idea of a definition for socialization, which is basically the process by which human beings acquire the ways of society.